The flames danced in the night, casting an eerie orange glow across the quiet suburban street. I stood frozen in horror, my heart pounding in my chest, as Margaret Hayes, the president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, HOA, struck the match and dropped it onto my son's gasoline-soaked wheelchair. The specialized chair, my 16-year-old son Ethan's lifeline, erupted into flames. Ethan, paralyzed from a car accident, desperately crawled toward the burning wreckage, tears streaming down his face. His hands scraped against the rough concrete as he tried to reach the chair that had given him a semblance of independence. "The rules apply to everyone," Margaret hissed, her voice cold and unyielding. "No exceptions. Not even for your son. What would you do if someone destroyed your disabled child's independence because they believed rules mattered more than people?" After my divorce, Ethan and I moved to Willow Creek Estates, seeking stability and a fresh start. Ethan had been a star athlete with scholarship offers until a drunk driver shattered his spine, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. I walked away from the accident with minor injuries, but my son lost the use of his legs in an instant. Insurance provided a basic wheelchair, but Ethan's therapist recommended a specialized outdoor model that would allow him to navigate our neighborhood's steep hills independently. Working double shifts and taking out a loan, I finally purchased the custom chair that reignited the spark in Ethan's eyes. I'll never forget the day it arrived. For the first time since the accident, I heard Ethan laugh as he raced down our driveway. That chair wasn't just equipment, it was his freedom, his hope, his way back to living. He could join his friends at the park again, attend school events without my help, and even started adaptive sports with other teens. "Mom," Ethan said that first evening with his new chair, "I feel normal again." Those 5 words made every extra shift, every penny of that loan, worth it. My boy was finding his way back from the darkness that had consumed him since the accident. Margaret Hayes, the HOA president, initially welcomed us warmly. A widow in her 50s, she seemed genuinely concerned about Ethan's condition, even bringing us a casserole our first week. But the facade cracked when Ethan's specialized wheelchair arrived. Within days, a warning letter appeared on our doorstep. Unauthorized equipment must not be stored in public view per HOA Regulation 37.4. I called Margaret, explaining that Ethan needed easy access between his indoor and outdoor chairs. She seemed sympathetic during our conversation. "Let me see what I can do," she promised. But at the next HOA meeting, her tone changed dramatically. "The Carter family is requesting a special exemption that threatens our community standards," she announced. "If we allow this exception, what's next? The rules exist for a reason, to maintain order. Once we start making exceptions, the whole system falls apart." Several neighbors defended us, creating the first crack in Margaret's authority, something she clearly resented. I approached her after the meeting, trying to reason with her. "This isn't about breaking rules," I explained. "It's about my son's independence." Her eyes hardened. "Everyone has problems, Mrs. Carter. The rules don't change because of personal circumstances." When I mentioned the Americans with Disabilities Act might protect Ethan's right to reasonable accommodations, Margaret's smile turned cold. "We'll see about that," she whispered, walking away. That's when I realized this wasn't about regulations. This was about control. As we left the meeting, our neighbor Tom whispered, "Be careful. Margaret's been president for 15 years. Those who challenge her tend to regret it." I should have taken his warning more seriously. The harassment intensified methodically. Daily violation notices, escalating fines, and threatening legal letters arrived. Each time I proposed a compromise, Margaret found a reason to reject it. I discovered the real motivation behind Margaret's obsession after her husband's death. She had devoted herself entirely to controlling the HOA. The rigid enforcement of rules had become her purpose, her way of creating the order she couldn't maintain in her personal life. Several long-term residents confided that she had become increasingly authoritarian over the years. When I presented these concerns at the next meeting, suggesting her personal issues were influencing HOA decisions, several board members looked uncomfortable. Margaret's face flushed with anger. "My dedication to this community is absolute," she snapped. "Without proper order and control, society descends into chaos. That's what's happening to this country already. People wanting special treatment instead of following the rules." The next day, Ethan found a note taped to his wheelchair. "Rules must be followed by everyone." Consider a more appropriate neighborhood for your situation. I installed security cameras, capturing Margaret walking past our house multiple times daily, documenting violations, and once attempting to wheel the chair away before noticing the camera. It was a small victory, as I now had evidence of harassment. Meanwhile, Ethan withdrew into depression. "Maybe we should just move, Mom," he whispered one night. "I don't want to be the reason everyone's fighting." Those words ignited a protective fire in me. No one would make my son feel like he didn't belong. Last Tuesday began with unexpected hope. Margaret called, sounding conciliatory. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said. "Perhaps there's a compromise we can discuss. Could we meet this afternoon?" Her voice carried a warmth I hadn't heard in weeks. Relief washed over me. We met at her immaculate home, where she served tea in fine china cups. "I think I've been too rigid," she admitted, looking genuinely remorseful. "Your son deserves accommodation." She showed me sketches of a possible storage solution that would keep the wheelchair accessible but partially screened from street view. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lifting from my shoulders. After our meeting, I called Ethan immediately, excitement in my voice. "I think it's going to work out, honey. Margaret's finally listening." Ethan's cautious optimism broke my heart a little. He'd become so used to disappointment. That evening, Ethan had adaptive basketball practice. I was working late at the hospital, covering an extra shift to help pay for wheelchair maintenance. Ethan texted that his friend's mom would drop him home around 6:30. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Perfect," I replied. "We'll celebrate tonight." As I pulled into our driveway at 7 p.m., an orange glow illuminated our front yard. Through my windshield, I witnessed a scene from a nightmare. Margaret standing with a gas can, watching Ethan's specialized wheelchair burn. My son had crawled halfway up our walkway, desperately reaching toward his burning lifeline. The betrayal hit me like physical pain. She had used our compromise meeting to learn exactly when our house would be empty, when Ethan would be returning without me. All her kindness, her seeming understanding, it had been calculated to set up this moment. I slammed on the brakes and launched myself from the car, screaming Ethan's name. My son's face was streaked with tears, his hands scraped raw from crawling across our concrete walkway. The specialized wheelchair, the one we'd sacrificed so much for, was engulfed in flames, black smoke billowing into the evening sky. I ran toward my son while calling 911, screaming at Margaret to get away from him. "What have you done?" I shrieked, kneeling beside Ethan, pulling him into my arms. "The board voted against your exception request," she said with chilling calm, the gas can still dangling from her hand. "This is what happens when people think they're above the rules. Rules create safety, structure, and fairness. No exceptions." Ethan was sobbing against my shoulder, his body shaking. "Mom," I tried to stop her, he choked out. "She waited until they dropped me off. Said she was doing what needed to be done." Margaret looked down at us with something like pity mixed with disgust. "You'll thank me eventually," she said. "Order benefits everyone. Your son needs to learn that the world doesn't bend to accommodate every personal challenge." I felt something snap inside me, a fundamental shift from fear to fury. "You didn't destroy a wheelchair," I said, my voice deadly quiet. "You destroyed my child's independence, his dignity, his trust in people." I looked up at her, still holding Ethan. "And for that, I promise you'll answer." The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Margaret's expression didn't change. "I'll explain to the police that this was necessary enforcement of community regulations," she said confidently. "I've documented everything, your continued violations, your refusal to comply." In that moment, looking at her self-righteous certainty, I knew this woman had to be stopped. Not just for Ethan, but for everyone she'd bullied with her twisted sense of order. The police and fire department arrived within minutes. Neighbors poured from their homes, gasping at the scene unfolding on our lawn. Officer Reynolds, a Vietnam veteran himself, barely contained his disgust as he handcuffed Margaret. "In 40 years of serving my community, I've never seen someone hide such cruelty behind rules and regulations," he said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. As paramedics checked Ethan for injuries, Mr. Henderson from across the street stepped forward. "I'm on the board, and we never voted on this," he announced firmly. "Margaret has been acting without board approval for months, claiming emergency powers." 2 other board members nodded in agreement. The first domino in Margaret's power structure had fallen. That night, While Ethan finally slept, I made a promise. This woman hadn't just destroyed property, she'd attacked my child's dignity and independence. Her reign of tyranny was about to end. The paramedics confirmed Ethan had suffered minor burns trying to save his wheelchair, along with cuts and scrapes from crawling across the concrete. But the real damage wasn't physical. I watched something die in my son's eyes that evening: his trust in people, his sense of belonging in our community. As neighbors brought blankets and offered support, I heard whispers spreading through the crowd. She's been lying to us for years. Remember what she did to the Wilsons? Someone finally needs to stand up to her. For the first time, I realized we weren't alone in this fight. Years of Margaret's tyranny had created a silent majority, waiting for someone to take a stand. By morning, I had already set 3 wheels in motion. First, I shared our security footage with local news outlets. The video showing Margaret's calculated attack went viral within hours. Veterans groups and first responders began calling, offering support, many outraged that someone would use rules as an excuse to target a vulnerable teenager. Second, I hired Thomas Ramirez, an attorney specializing in disability discrimination and HOA disputes. This isn't just a property crime, he explained. This is a violation of federal law under the ADA and possibly a hate crime against a disabled person. Third, and this proved most devastating, I began quietly investigating how Margaret had been running the HOA. A former board member, a retired accountant, helped me analyze the HOA's records. What we discovered was stunning. Margaret had been systematically eliminating board oversight, changing bylaws without proper notification, and running the community like her personal fiefdom. She had gradually rewritten voting procedures to consolidate her power and implemented a complex web of regulations that only she fully understood. Most damning of all, she had created a separate enforcement committee consisting only of her closest allies, which had imposed excessive fines on residents she disliked while ignoring violations by her supporters. My first victory came when Mr. Henderson called to inform me the board had unanimously voted to remove Margaret as president and was cooperating fully with the police investigation. The community's response was overwhelming. Neighbors I'd barely spoken to brought home-cooked meals, offered rides for Ethan, and shared their own stories of Margaret's tyranny. Thomas called with good news. The district attorney was taking our case seriously. They've upgraded the charges to include felony destruction of medical equipment and potential hate crime enhancements, he said. She's facing real jail time. Meanwhile, our security footage had caught the attention of national media. A prominent news show wanted to interview us about HOA abuse of power. This wasn't just about Ethan's wheelchair anymore. It had become a movement against unchecked authority and those who use rules to justify cruelty. Margaret's carefully constructed power structure collapsed spectacularly over the next weeks. The local newspaper ran a devastating 3-part series titled Neighborhood Tyrant: When HOA Power Goes Unchecked, featuring interviews with over a dozen residents who had been bullied, fined, or threatened by Margaret for minor infractions. A retired couple came forward with evidence that Margaret had forced them to remove a flagpole displaying an American flag because it was 6 inches taller than regulation, despite the husband being a decorated Korean War veteran. Then came the bombshell. A former board secretary revealed Margaret had been selectively enforcing rules based on personal vendettas, keeping a secret problem residents list, and had once stated in a private meeting, "Democracy is inefficient. Communities need strong leadership, not endless debate." As more residents spoke out, a pattern emerged of a woman obsessed with control who viewed compassion as weakness and compromise as failure. Many described how she had transformed from a reasonable neighbor into an increasingly rigid autocrat after her husband's death. The district attorney expanded charges to include fraud, harassment, and violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The judge denied bail, citing the calculated cruelty of her actions against a disabled minor. My attorney delivered news of another victory. The court had issued an injunction prohibiting Margaret from having any contact with HOA affairs and ordered a complete review of all fines and sanctions she had imposed in the past 5 years. The investigation into HOA records revealed that Margaret had maintained 2 sets of books, one for the board and another documenting her actual activities. She'd been running a shadow government, making unilateral decisions while presenting them as board-approved. Each new revelation strengthened our case. Former allies abandoned her, including her enforcement committee members, who now claim they'd been manipulated and misled about their actions against neighbors. In perhaps the most satisfying moment, her attorney approached us about a plea deal, admitting that her defense had collapsed as evidence mounted. She never expected anyone to fight back this effectively, he confided. She's never faced real consequences before. While Margaret's power crumbled, something unexpected happened in our community. Neighbors who had been intimidated into silence began speaking to each other again, sharing stories and rebuilding connections. The newly elected HOA board, led by Mr. Henderson and including a committee of residents with diverse backgrounds, created the neighborhood's first community bill of rights that prioritized people over procedures. A local veterans group, outraged by how Ethan had been treated, organized a fundraiser that provided a new customized wheelchair with advanced features. Retired contractors volunteered to build wheelchair-accessible ramps at our home and the community center. Ethan's school organized an adaptive sports exhibition, bringing awareness to accessibility issues. My son was asked to speak, and watching him address the crowd from his new chair, confidence radiating from him, was the sweetest victory of all. The greatest irony came when the court ordered Margaret to pay substantial damages, and the judgment included the forfeiture of her home to cover the costs. The very home she had used as a headquarters to control the neighborhood. Our community began hosting monthly gatherings where neighbors actually talked to each other instead of just attending meetings to hear rules enforced. Children played in front yards again without fear of violation notices. Gardens became expressions of personality rather than compliance. The transformation wasn't just about physical changes, it was about rediscovering what community truly means. People started checking on elderly neighbors, organizing meal trains for families facing illness, and celebrating differences instead of enforcing sameness. Ethan found himself surrounded by supporters and friends. The same neighbors who had once averted their eyes from his wheelchair now asked him for advice on making their homes more accessible for visitors. His trauma began to heal as he realized most people were nothing like Margaret. Today, our family still lives in Willow Creek, now a community where neighbors know each other's names again, and where common sense and compassion guide decisions rather than rigid adherence to arbitrary rules. Margaret now serves time in a minimum security prison, with additional years of community service specifically working with disability organizations awaiting her upon release. The neighborhood has adopted what locals call the Ethan Carter Principle, a commitment that no regulation should ever override basic human dignity and that rules exist to serve people, not the other way around. My son, once pushed into depression by cruelty disguised as order, now mentors other teenagers with disabilities. Sometimes people think following rules makes them right, he tells them. But what makes us truly strong is knowing when compassion should come before regulations. As for me, I've learned that protecting what matters sometimes means standing against those who use rules and procedures as weapons. Our freedom and dignity are too precious to sacrifice on the altar of someone else's need for control. Sometimes, it takes a fire to burn away what's toxic and remind us what truly matters in a community, not perfect compliance, but perfect compassion. The lawsuit sparked a nationwide conversation about HOA power and disability rights. Several states have since passed Ethan's laws, requiring HOAs to provide reasonable accommodations for residents with disabilities. When I look out my window now, I see a neighborhood that's alive again. Children playing, gardens flourishing, neighbors helping each other without fear, and Ethan racing down the street in his new chair, surrounded by friends. Finally, truly home. The wheelchair burning was meant to break us. Instead, it ignited something powerful, a community's rediscovery of its soul, and my discovery of a strength I never knew I had. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.